It's 9:09. Well, Immigration Minister Roger Maxwell has suggested an almost doubling of our annual migrant intake. He's told a population conference in Australia, the third National Immigration and Population Outlook Conference in Adelaide, that New Zealanders haven't thought about what size of population we should have. He says some people have floated a target of 5 million, others want an end to immigration altogether, which would see the population reduce. He says there has not been a public debate in New Zealand on optimum immigration and population levels. And as long as it's unresolved, he says immigration policy will continue to serve as a de facto population policy. He told the conference that it's as good an opportunity as any to get the ball rolling on the issue, particularly since it was thousands of kilometres away from critics in New Zealand. I'm joined, perhaps, I suspect, by one of those critics now, Dr. Ranginui Walker. Good morning, Kia ora.
Good morning.
And Aussie Malcolm, who's an ex-Minister of Immigration, who's now involved in consultancy work on the issue. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Kim.
Now, Dr. Walker, is there any problem? I know, because I've talked to you quite recently about the immigration issue. I know that you believe that immigration is not something that New Zealand should encourage. Do you think there's any problem with the immigration minister tossing the ball up in the air for discussion on the issue?
I think he's wrong. New Zealand has thought about population, and they have made a deliberate decision to limit family size. I think the reproduction rate at the moment is running at 2.1, which is just replacement, keeping a static population in relation to resources of the country. Now, that's a conscious, deliberate decision made by all New Zealanders, and the government is flying in the face of that decision now by an artificial measure to increase the population.
Are you telling me that people only have 2.4 children?
2.1. That's the reproductive rate.
Because they want to limit the population?
Yes, they want, because, having children is an expensive business.
Indeed.
And people have to balance resources and the need to have children.
But domestic finances are not relevant, surely, to population.
If domestic finances are relevant, surely the country's finances are relevant too, because, we're part of this political economy.
So you're saying that we already have a de facto population policy, and
That's
that
correct.
is equivalent to an immigration policy?
No, it is a conscious decision to have a steady state population vis-a-vis the resources of this country.
But what
now,
about
that's a decision made by all New Zealanders.
Oh, okay, but all New Zealanders do not have 2.1 children. So are you telling me that the people who do not have 2.1 children are in favour of increasing population, and the people who have 1.5 children are in favour of it falling?
No, I'm not making any comment on those who are not having children.
But that's the nonsense of using that statistic to imply some kind of national consensus. It doesn't make sense to me.
No, it's an intuitive decision that people have arrived at.
Intuitive? Let me put it this way, because I think my mathematics might not be up to it. If you took an average of all the children in the country and brought it down to an average of 3.5 children per family, or 1.2 children per family, would that imply that we had a different population policy? What would it mean? What does it matter?
I'm not sure what you're getting at, Tim.
What I'm getting at is you're seeing a significance in 2.1 children, an average family size in New Zealand, 2.1 children.
We've had a very slow rate of population growth over the last 100 years.
Right.
And it's always been the case. Now, the government is resorting to an artificial means of pumping up the population by a deliberate policy of bringing in more than 20,000 people and talking about doubling that.
People also need to want to come here. I mean, it's not like the government's going out and saying, you must go to New Zealand because we need to artificially increase the population. People need to have some kind of natural inclination to come here. Is that not part of the great balance of life?
Well, you've got to ask, why do people want to come here? What are their motives? And you will find that they're basically egocentric.
Egocentric?
Yep.
How come?
They want to come to New Zealand to give their children a better life.
That
want to escape.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Of course it's reasonable, perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
But they want to escape from overcrowded, polluted, traffic-congested countries like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and countries where political regimes are tottering, such as South Africa.
So to put it in a nutshell, you're saying they've made a mess of their own country and they're coming out here.
That's correct.
All right.
They're escaping from uncongenial conditions which they have created, and they want to come to New Zealand. Now, if we were to conceptualize New Zealand as the last lifeboat, and the lifeboat has a carrying capacity of 50, and it's already full, and there's another 50 swimming, are you going to allow those people into the lifeboat?
Paul, thanks for that presentation. I had to stop scribbling furiously because it was going to throw me off course on my presentation. There are some extraordinary continuities between Australia and New Zealand that you mentioned. What I want to do is walk you through where I think immigration policy in Australia fits in terms of our open economic model. And I view the immigration program the way it's functioning now, with the emphasis on skill. Not just emphasis on skill, but the try before you buy aspect of it. Most of the recruiting we now do is onshore. So a bit over half the permanent settlers in Australia changed categories. So they were temporary migrants before they settled, and that's occurred in the last couple of years. Now I view the way the program has evolved, and it's sort of evolved out of sight of the public, and I think a lot of politicians are not that clued up on what it means themselves. I've given a couple of presentations now internally to the public service in Australia on precisely this topic, that I don't think people understand how profound the changes we've had over the last 15 years in particular are. Now, one way to think about the migration program today is that it's become the fifth pillar of the open model. Now, the open model, as you've heard Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard tell you ad infinitum, and we went one more time around the world for sport in the television documentary a couple of years ago for the ABC. It was essentially a process by which 4 of the main prices in the economy were taken off the cabinet table and handed over to the market. The floating of the dollar, the setting of interest rates independently of government by the Reserve Bank, wages set at the enterprise level, and of course through the removal of the tariff wall, the absence of any government control over import prices or the quantity of imports. I would add migration as the fifth pillar for the following reasons. The government today does not have the control over the migration problem that it once did. And that is because it's demand driven and most of it is set by the market. So the numbers that come in, the government can control the flow, but the actual numbers that come into Australia in any given year is actually determined by the market and by education institutions. And the numbers themselves are quite profound. The only way to really get your head around it is to understand that we're adding an extra 1 million people a decade because of overseas migration. And the reason, as I said, if you look at it as the fifth pillar and it's demand driven, growing uninterrupted for 25 years is one of the reasons why you'd be adding this many migrants. But the other reason we're adding this many migrants is that the Chinese and Indians are choosing us. And the Chinese and Indians are emigrating at a rate that has no comparison in human history outside of the 19th century. And think about what the Chinese and Indians are doing. These are 2 rising nations, but their middle class is emigrating for the same reasons roughly that the British were emigrating in the 19th century. The middle class is moving because they're leaving a political system that's not quite ideal for them, an environment that's degraded, cities that are overcrowded. They're actually moving for opportunity. Think about what's going to happen in the next few years where there's scarcity, where Australians previously assumed almost universal access. And this is the local-born population, not the Indigenous population, it's the local-born population I'm talking about. If you start to get to a situation in Australia where you have Indigenous plus local-born disadvantage, and it's driven primarily because we're on a default setting because the migration program is keeping the macro data ticking over.
Aussie Malcolm, that's a fair point. I mean, we don't need to go so far as to call immigrants egocentric predators, but nevertheless, they've made a mess of their own place. They want to come here because it's green and area and less populated. There is a certain irony in that, isn't there?
Well, I think that's a gross oversimplification, but I would like to address a far more fundamental issue, Kim, because Dr. Walker suggests that falling fecundity rates, that is the number of children we have, is an indication of some sort of a deliberate decision by New Zealanders to find a consensus immigration policy. Now, I find that proposition not logical because the effect of falling family size is causing a distinct distortion in the aging of our population, and one of the side effects of smaller family sizes, which I suspect, by the way, is a result of higher affluence, because around the world more affluent people have less children than do less affluent people. So I think it's an effect of affluence, not a conscious decision to limit population. But the effect of that, the side effect of that, is that we have an aging population, that we in the future are going to have fewer and fewer young people who are in their high earning capacity in the workforce.
As a consequence of what Dr. Walker pointed out, we have a 2.1 children average.
Yeah. And that what's going to happen in the relatively near future in New Zealand is that we're going to have fewer and fewer working Kiwis supporting more and more non-working Kiwis.
Which, Dr. Walker, could be an economic problem. Would you accept that?
And a social problem, Kim.
Dr. Walker, would you accept that we actually do need more working people in this country to sustain the increasingly ageing population?
No, I don't accept that proposition at all.
Why?
That's one of the smart arguments that the demographers have worked out to sustain this immigration policy.
Oh, it's a rationale rather than a reason. Why doesn't it make sense to you that if we have an increasing number of people who are unable to work because they are too old, we will need an increasing number of workers to sustain them?
Okay, so I want to start with this New Zealand Institute of Economic Research's suggestion that New Zealand should have a population of 15 million by 2061, because this is the argument that people keep coming back to me with. Okay, so if we were to assume that the birth rate, 2.1 births per woman, is what you need to replace the population, if that remained constant, we push life expectancy at birth up to 95 years, and that's Stats New Zealand's highest assumption, and we give it for both males and females. We increase annual net migration to 100,000 a year. Normally it's around about, well, the medium variant is about 12,000 a year. If we keep the age structure of migrants very youthful, notwithstanding what I just said about the fact that we'll be competing on a diminishing pool, and migration positive at all ages, so that instead of what we usually do is we lose young people and we gain people at ever so slightly older, like middle ages. We keep it positive at all ages. Our 2061 population would be 10.8 million, and 22% would be over the age of 65. So it's really bigger population, not much difference in terms of the actual ageing. And if you happen to read the NZIER report, they point out right through it the impossibility of achieving the possible target population of 15 million. So it's really important that you understand those things, because the debate, and I keep getting calls from the media about it, it's not about whether it's achievable, it's about where should they live, you know? What will they be like? Who will they be? And, you know, how are we going to manage this big population? And it's impossible. So it's much more important that we engage with the realities that we're dealing with, and that is the fact that there will be growth, but most of that growth will be at the older ages. If we wanted to get that 15 million population by 2061, and I tried various runs on with my software, we'd want 150,000 net migrants a year. We'd have to keep the fertility rate at 2.1. New Zealand, as I'll say again in a minute, already has the highest birth rate in the developed world, so we would really be pushing it. Or we need the birth rate to get back up to baby boom levels, about 3.5 births per woman. and keep it, a more achievable 100,000 migrants a year. So you see the difficulty. It's really not possible. And it's not possible because of these inconvenient truths about population ageing. So, said that, actually highest birth rate in the developed world. Our global growth rate, as you saw, is looking pretty good. We've got lots and lots of young Kiwis that seem to be popping up everywhere. And in fact, be careful if you want to close any of your schools or have them closed on you.
I pointed out New Zealand has had a slow rate of population growth for the last 100 years.
Yes.
And, the world didn't collapse around us as a consequence of that slow population growth.
No, but we are changing our demographic profile, and because older people are living longer, we will have more of them. Therefore, we're going to have an unbalanced population profile, as it were. Do you agree that that's the case, or do you say it doesn't matter?
I think the country has enough resources to sustain that imbalance until that distortion works its way through the population base.
Well, Kim, that's Dr. Walker's view. I think the statistics, and he criticises demographers as somehow being manipulators, but I don't think they are. The statistics, if presented to the public, would lead a lot of members of the public to come to a contrary point of view than Dr. Walker has expressed. And coming back to the real issue, I think the Minister is really being quite brave, and I think he's being quite appropriate in addressing this issue and tossing the ball into the court for us Kiwis to play with, because the Minister is fundamentally right. For years we have had immigration policies, but we have run away from the issue of a population debate. And I think that in a participating democracy, it's important that we do have some concept of a population policy. What do we really want as New Zealanders?
He says there are two factors to bear in mind. He says there's an upper limit for the population level, which Dr. Walker says we've already reached, I guess, and the rate at which immigrants can be absorbed into the economy and society. Now, will we ever get a consensus on what the upper limit for the population should be?
In a general sort of a way, I think we're capable of getting a broad consensus, provided we have a debate. And the point that the Minister, I think, is making, which is absolutely true, is that we run away from the debate. Now, what tends to happen is that in the absence of a good public debate about the real issues, people have surrogate debates. They have de facto debates. Let me give you an example of that. At present, a number of Maori in the New Zealand community, I think, feel threatened. They have unresolved land rights treaty of Waitangi claims. They have a sense that their culture and their language is at risk of dying and becoming something of a minority artifact in their own country. Those are valid concerns. They then see the population structure of New Zealand changing, and they worry about whether or not this new migration is going to further threaten Maori interests. Now, those issues I understand very well. I think, however, that if we can get a proper population debate going, if we can identify what our population objectives are in New Zealand, then we can more properly identify what are the issues that need to go hand in glove with a proper population policy. For example, if we have a population policy to achieve a certain target by a certain year, does that bring with it the obligation to assist migrants to become true New Zealanders, that is, to understand Treaty of Waitangi issues, to understand cultural issues in New Zealand, to understand the nature of the multicultural and bicultural society we're trying to develop? If we don't have a proper population debate, if we brush that under the carpet, then in fact we're not able to address the secondary issues, and then we get a spluttering anger coming from some sectors of the population because they see themselves as somehow threatened.
There
Now,
are.
my view is
Yeah.
that having a population debate helps to bring that out in the open and to address the issues
I
in
think
a
you need
healthy
to
way.
bring out a lot more than the factors you've just mentioned, Aussie. Way back in '91, when the Immigration Amendment Bill was being touted, there were 75 submissions received by the committee. 73 of those were opposed to an increase in immigration, and 2 in favour. And the 2 in favour were immigration consultants, as you know, who get fees of between $5,000 and $10,000 for processing immigrant applications. And furthermore, the government sees these immigrants as productive economic units. And to me, this is a gross objectification and commodification of people. The result of that commodification of people is that when the units become unproductive, they're then classed as overstayers by the then Minister, Mr. Birch, who wanted over 7,000 Samoans out and 4,900 Tongans out and 1,000 Fijians. So as long as they are defined as productive, they're wanted in. But as soon as they become unproductive, they're wanted out. And I find this a gross dehumanizing policy.
But isn't it dehumanizing, Dr. Walker, for you to say, we've got enough people here, we don't want any more, and anybody who wants to come here can just think again, because we're not taking you in. Now that's commodification. We can't afford you, and we don't want you, and you're foreign. This is our place.
It's not inhuman. It is a rational thought. Those people have their own countries. They're messing it up. Surely they'd better stay there and clean it up.
But Kim, I'm sorry. Dr. Walker obviously is talking from, or speaking from, a basis in which he's come to a conclusion and he seeks to rationalize it, because some of the things he's saying simply aren't correct. I mean, the arguments about the submissions in 91 aren't correct.
Okay.
And
What, you mean there were more people in favour of immigration than only consultants?
The 1991 Amendment Bill he's referring to was nothing at all to do with population policy, and he therefore can't say that the submissions were in favour or against a population policy, because that wasn't the issue. And this is the point that I think the Minister is making, and that is that it's time to have a population debate, because if you have a population debate, then you can bring into the open technical information, statistics, demography. Dr. Walker can make his suggestions and he can put up his arguments and have them knocked down as factually incorrect. And at the end of the day, we'll come to a more logical conclusion and more people will be informed about the issues. And
you also feed in the downstream costs of the teaching of English as a second language to new immigrants. The fact that at Auckland University, tutorials now have to be conducted in Mandarin in 1 or 2 departments. The downstream costs in Auckland of improving our sewage, our water system, our motorway system to cope with increase in congestion.
That's a fair point, Aussie.
That's going to be mega bucks down the line, and we, the New Zealand taxpayers, will pay for that.
The arguments that Ranginui Walker is making aren't rational.
Immigrants who come to New Zealand at the moment, many of them are Asian, probably 50%, and most of them will want to live in Auckland.
All right. Aussie Malcolm, that's a fair point, isn't it? That there are clear costs as well as less tangible benefits involved in this debate.
Well, let's attack the underlying issue, because this is a population debate which the Minister has got going. And the point I've got to make is that at present we do not have a rapidly growing population. And therefore the arguments that Ranginui Walker makes about more cars on our roads and more children in schools, etc., is not necessarily a rational argument in the context where our present migrant inflow doesn't properly equate to the outflow of New Zealanders who travel overseas and leave New Zealand anyway. In other words, we don't presently have a population policy. We don't presently have a program which is dramatically changing the total volume of New Zealand's population. So when Ranginui Walker suggests that roads are getting crowded by migrants and schools are getting crowded by migrants, he's not really correct. I mean, the problems in Auckland are all to do with town planning. They're nothing to do with migrants. They're to do with town planning and infill housing. So if we have a population debate, we can grasp some of these shallow arguments that people like Ranginui Walker are making.
With respect, Aussie,
we can debate them.
This is not about a population debate. It's about a political debate. It's about the political economy. That is, policies that are roundtable driven, and the government implements those roundtable driven policies of increasing population, increasing economic units, increasing productivity and growth. That's the essence of the argument. It's not about population.
I think if we have a population policy, though, Ranginui, we're going to be able to ask questions of the public, like, for example, this question: do you want to maintain some form of superannuation scheme? Now, if New Zealanders want to maintain some sort of superannuation scheme into their 60s and 70s and beyond, they're going to have to do something about the number of young people in the workforce who are contributing to the tax base, because our present population profile is not going to sustain it. If we want to ask, do we want improved educational facilities in New Zealand, we have to ask where the economic growth is going to come from to fuel that. If we want to continue providing improved performance in Maori land issues, if we want to get a resolution of some of the long-standing grievances, that brings a cost with it in some cases, and that has to be funded by a strong economy. And so rather than a proper population policy necessarily threatening existing things in New Zealand, if it's properly debated and properly planned, it can sustain and support the things that we in New Zealand treat as being of great value.
Aussie, we wouldn't have this problem of superannuation if governments were honest. I have contributed to the government superannuation scheme all my working life, and there is no pool of money there. It is paid out of current revenue, superannuation. And, you know, those of us who entered the government superannuation scheme believed there was a pool of money which was invested at X% interest, and those who became superannuated lived off the interest. There is no such pool.
Just to avoid Dr. Walker.
That's a key point, Kim.
Can
I just address it? Because it's a key point.
You can.
You see, Ranginui, when he says that the government didn't keep the pool, the fact is that at the time those superannuation programs were set up, to which Ranginui contributed, it was the belief, the honest belief and understanding of New Zealanders at that stage, that their population would stay balanced and the ratio between older and younger people would remain constant. And this is the point of the issue.
Right.
That hasn't occurred.
Now, further than that, I think that Dr. Walker, you're saying that we may have problems in this country, but they are internal problems, and you ain't going to solve them by shipping in immigrants, correct?
That's correct.
And Aussie Malcolm, you're saying that immigrants have more to give than to gain from living in New Zealand.
Yes, with a condition, Kim, and this is the point at which there needs to be a crossover between the population debate and the immigration debate.
Right.
The immigration policy must be one that selects people at a rate and with a profile which is truly advantageous for New Zealand. Now, my point is that it's not just a question of numbers. It's a question of what assets, what education, what relevance to our society do those migrants bring with them. If they are relevant, contributing members of New Zealand society who adapt and become Kiwis, then they are of value if the numbers are right. If they are not relevant people who are able to contribute to New Zealand society, then one has to question the immigration policy. And I hope that one of the things that emerges out of this debate is that there is a difference between a population debate and an immigration policy debate. They're two separate issues.
That's the clear point that Roger Maxwell's made in his speech. I thank you both for your time, Aussie Malcolm and Dr. Ranginui Walker. And I thank Roger Maxwell, too, for raising the speech in Adelaide, raising the issue in his speech in Adelaide and sending me the speech notes. And hopefully we will be able to catch up with him in the course of the morning because it's still quite early in Adelaide. It's 28 minutes to 10. So the Immigration Minister's on the line. Good morning to you.
Good morning,
You're
Kim.
still in Adelaide.
That's right,
And
at the conference.
What was the response to your speech in Adelaide? Because clearly, as you made the point, Australia and Canada have had a public debate on optimum immigration and population levels. We have not had it in New Zealand.
Yes, and the conference really here is part of a process occurring in Australia about whether or not they should have a formal population policy. It's a number of issues that have been tossed around in the community here for some time, and their melting pot, if you like, is a lot more complex than ours.
Why do we need any immigrants at all?
Well, I think what's happening in the world today is the world's getting very much smaller, and people are travelling in a much more free way than they've been able to in the past. And I don't think we can actually stop that, even if we wanted to. And
Well, they can travel through. I mean, they don't have to stop here.
No, but we also, our standard of living, if you like, our future is based on our ability to interact with those people and trade with countries around the world. And
can I just take you through this, because there are a number of arguments that Dr. Ranginui Walker, for one, does not accept, and we've just spoken to him. Why is it necessary to have people residing in New Zealand in order to trade with the countries that they came from?
Well, I think knowing the culture very well and having the networks of people that result, or that extra ability to network with people in other countries where you're trading, is a tremendous advantage for a country like New Zealand, which, because of the size of its population, if it wants to have a high standard of living, I believe has to trade internationally and be very effective in that process.
So we can't trade without having people from the countries we trade with?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm suggesting that our ability to trade is enhanced by having better networks than what we might be able to achieve as a result of sending people overseas through our agencies and the like in the private sector. I think it is enhanced, and that enhances our ability to have a higher standard of living for everyone.
So it's a hospitality issue, in effect?
Pardon?
It's a hospitality issue.
Well, depending what you mean by hospitality, it's certainly by having access to those networks as a result of having people of other countries and cultures living in New Zealand and understanding the customer better, that our whole ability to trade is enhanced, in my view, and I think there's plenty of proof to illustrate that.
Is there? Because it sounds rather intangible, and when you're up against people, and he's not on his own, Dr. Ranginui Walker, he says these people come here because they've made a mess of their own country, it's overcrowded, and it's polluted. They are egocentric and selfish. They come over here, we've got a nice green and relatively empty country, and they're going to mess it up. You're going to mess it up by having too many immigrants.
Well, don't forget that we're all been immigrants. In fact, we've had, as I said in my speech, when you look back retrospectively in New Zealand, we've had periods of immigration that have been much greater numbers and inflows than we are currently had, or certainly on the average of the last 3 or 4 years. And so really, yeah, I'm raising the issues because I think those issues are important and people really ought to talk about them. And at some stage there ought to be some consensus. There will be a range of views, and that's no different to the conference here in Adelaide, where we've got people wanting to have a white Australia, for example. Again, that whole process, I think, it has to take place.
Somebody should break the news to them that Australia's never been white as long as anybody white's been on Australia.
Well, I'm just using that as an illustration that people of all ilks, if you like, can take the extreme view. But what I'm arguing, I think, and interestingly enough, one of the other main speakers in the opening also canvassed the issue as a result of I think a House of Representatives study in Australia here saying should the current immigration policy of the day be a de facto population policy, or should we do something more formal about it? And, you can argue that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But if you've got some idea of what is acceptable to the nation or the people as a whole, you'll then have a greater ability to adapt your policies to actually achieve that objective.
So as you've said in your speech, we have to bear in mind two factors: an upper limit for the population level and the rate at which immigrants can be absorbed into the economy and society.
Without doubt, and I think...
There's a third issue, though, isn't there? Who will the immigrants be? Where will they come from? Who will we choose?
Yes, that certainly is an important issue in that whole process. And at the moment, traditionally we've sourced the main groups of immigrants, and we still do. The UK is our biggest sort of migration. We really source them globally. And that's why I think the profile of some of the immigrant groups is perhaps higher than it has been in the past, even though we've had periods when the rate of migration has been just as high as it's been in the last 12 months or so. And the difference being, of course, they are of a different culture, albeit familiar with some of our ways, and that's what, if you like, gives them a higher profile.
You're going to buy a fight whatever you do on this. I mean, if you say, for example, the hot issue at the moment is resourcing of migrants and giving them enough resources to live here comfortably. Now, if you give them a lot of resources to settle down, then you'll have people saying, why on earth are we spending so much on people who, after all, have chosen to come here themselves? If you don't recommend that a lot of money being spent on them, you'll be criticised for leaving them to their own devices and draining the public purse. What do you think the answer to that problem
Well, I think
is?
we've got the best, I think, model to get the benefit from migration as perhaps any country I've seen at the moment that we've studied, and that is we are targeting people who are young, highly qualified, and can make a real contribution to our society and our economy. And as a result of that, we, if you like, we are very selective in most of our migrants. And if we do that, I think there's plenty of evidence to show that there is real benefits for the country as a whole. And it's where you put your mix, and that's why the fine-tuning is going on at the moment, which is a current government policy of a positive migration flow, selecting those people, if you like, who enhance New Zealand's capital. And, of course, the benefits and those younger people generally, despite the exception which you can quote, make a really fine contribution to New Zealand as a whole.
So, as I understand it then, you're putting up for debate the concept of a 1% annual gain in population from migration, which would mean 35,000 immigrants a year. This is what you want to float?
I think that's something that people should debate, and I'm not looking for controversy. I'm looking for a reasoned argument about what the process should be. Currently, we've got a net migration gain around the 20,000, and that's, I think, comfortable. If we went to a higher target, that might put some extra pressures, particularly if the new migrants all settled in one place. And again, that may be able to be affected by a change of slant in the policy in terms of requiring people to be outside of the main centres as a condition of permanent residence for a certain period of years. You can't stop the internal migration of people who are citizens of New Zealand, but I think the argument there could be put that if they stay in one place for, say, 2 or 3 years or more, they tend to settle with their families in that community. So, there's a whole lot of issues in this process of migration, which the immigration policy is currently attempting to address.
But it seems a bit late in the day. I mean, thus far then, if I read you correctly, we've had some kind of ad hoc system that hasn't worked very well, and now it's time to start thinking about it properly.
No, I think what we've had is, since the 1990 review, which was carried out by an independent group, which caused a bit of debate at the time, we've had a highly successful new policy put in place in 91. And all I'm arguing is that that's been so successful, it might be creating a few pressures and problems in our communities. And the English language debate that we've had in some areas of the country is a classic example
In
of that.
fact, the inability of the government to organise itself probably may well have skewed the immigration debate beyond repair, don't you think?
No, I wouldn't accept that argument. I think what we've already recognised that as the population or the flow of migrants comes into the country gets to a certain point, it will create some pressures. And the issue is whether we manage that, do we reduce the flow, and if we do, how do we actually manage that through the various policies? And that's why, if you like, the debate here in Australia, and I suggest perhaps should be the case in New Zealand, do we want to have a population policy? And if we do, the immigration policy will obviously play a major role in how we manage the flow of migrants, whatever the level might be.
Do you accept, though, that the government should have got its act together on this a little earlier, rather than let things get out of hand to the extent that people are saying, stop immigration, we can't afford it, these people can't speak English, we can't afford to waste time on it, they're undermining the education system, and then look like you're acting reactively to that?
No, I think there has been those same arguments put up when we virtually had a net migration loss. So, I think it's timely that we have such a debate. And I think when we go into the MMP environment, those sort of things will probably occur anyway. So let's think about whether or not that's the way New Zealand should go. I might add that in Australia here, some members of government don't think it should be the case, and that's part of the debating forum and issues that have been thrown around at this conference I'm attending. So it's a live debate here in Australia, and because of the very special relationship, the ability to generally flow freely across the Tasman, I think it's very important that if they are having that sort of debate here, we should also on our side of the Tasman, because we wouldn't want anything that is done in New Zealand or what we haven't done to affect that special relationship.
I appreciate your time. Thank you, Roger Maxwell, Minister of Immigration, talking to me from the Adelaide Conference, the third National Immigration and Population Outlook Conference on in Adelaide. At the moment, it's 13 minutes to 10.
Let me start with my pessimistic side. The last 5 to 7 years has seen a distinct shift in the Overton window in radicalising and normalising radical ideas yet again, and the sheer volume of it, the fact that it is a global ecosystem, online system, which makes it difficult for country states like ourselves to govern and to manage. And also, it is, to me, a little puzzling that you in Canada, we in New Zealand, should be so influenced by QAnon or sovereign citizen or any other sets of politics that come out of the United States, which bear no relationship in many respects to our own political histories, even though those, I'm not wanting to de-criticize those histories. I want to maintain a critical approach to them. So I do see a polarization, and what keeps me awake at night is how you overcome that degree of polarization, the unwillingness of communities to not treat others respectfully, to attack others, to be very vitriolic and hateful, and not to be guided by facts. Now, there's in terms of what we're doing, there's little that we can find yet to mount something which is effective in answer to that. And what's happened is, of course, that it's gone from being Indigenous or immigrant or Muslim or Jew to transphobic, misogynistic. And so my Prime Minister stood down because of the level of both domestic and international misogyny that she was facing.